Think about the last time you sat alone on a Friday night, completely by choice, and felt zero guilt about it. Maybe you turned down an invitation. Maybe you let a text go unanswered. And somewhere in the quiet, instead of feeling lonely, you felt something closer to relief, maybe even power. If that has ever been you, there is something specific happening inside your brain that most people around you will never fully understand. And by the end of this, not only will you understand it, you will finally have the language for something you have been carrying for a very long time without being able to explain it to anyone, including yourself. Here is what nobody talks about. There is a type of person who moves through life with a small circle, sometimes very small, and they are not broken, not antisocial, and not secretly suffering. They are, in many cases, some of the most psychologically grounded people in the room. But the world does not see it that way. The world hands you a story early. The more people around you, the more successful, lovable, and emotionally healthy you must be. Popularity becomes the metric. The group chat becomes the proof of life. And the person who quietly opts out of all of that gets a label: reserved, withdrawn, hard to reach, maybe even cold. What those labels miss is everything. What we are actually talking about today is the psychology of people who function with fewer friendships and who report a stronger, more defined sense of personal power because of it. Not in spite of it, because of it. And this is not a self-help take. This is not a consolation prize dressed up as insight. There is real, peer-reviewed science behind this that changes the entire conversation, and it starts somewhere most people would never think to look. It starts with energy. Neuroscientists studying social behavior have consistently found that human beings have a finite amount of cognitive and emotional bandwidth. There is a structure in the brain called the prefrontal cortex, and it handles things like decision-making, emotional regulation, and self-concept. Every meaningful social relationship you maintain places an ongoing low-level demand on that system. You are constantly tracking people, their moods, their expectations of you, their silent opinions about your choices. You self-monitor in real time. You adjust your tone, your word choice, your posture. You translate yourself into a version that fits each individual relationship. This happens mostly beneath conscious awareness, but the energy it costs is absolutely real, and it accumulates across a day, across a week, across years. Robin Dunbar, the British anthropologist whose work reshaped how we understand social cognition, proposed that the human brain can realistically maintain around 150 social relationships, but only about 5 of those can be truly close at any given time before the cognitive and emotional cost becomes unsustainable. That inner circle is where real depth lives. Everything beyond it is maintenance, and maintenance at that level is expensive in ways that never fully show up on the surface. People with fewer close friendships are not failing to reach their social capacity. In many cases, they are making an unconscious but remarkably efficient decision. Concentrate the resource where it actually compounds, depth over breadth, and the byproduct of that is a nervous system that is less chronically activated by social noise, which means more mental space, more emotional stability, more access to their own thinking, and yes, a stronger, more stable sense of self. Now here's where development enters the picture, because this pattern rarely just appears in adulthood out of nowhere. Many people who prefer fewer, deeper connections were shaped that way long before they had words for it. Some grew up in environments where relationships felt genuinely unpredictable. A parent whose warmth was conditional, a social world in childhood where loyalty shifted without warning and trust had a short shelf life. When connection is inconsistent in your formative years, the nervous system learns to treat large social webs as environments to navigate rather than places to rest. You become observant instead of open. You become selective rather than eager. Not because something went wrong with you, but because your nervous system adapted intelligently to protect you from something that used to cost too much. Others were simply born with what researchers call high neural sensitivity, a temperament trait studied extensively by psychologist Elaine Aron over decades of research. Roughly 15 to 20% of the population processes sensory and emotional information more deeply and thoroughly than others. For these individuals, a large, active social environment is not just tiring, it is genuinely overstimulating at a neurological level. The brain of a highly sensitive person is wired to pick up on more, register more, and process more from every single interaction. Fewer relationships is not withdrawal. It is calibration. It is the nervous system finding the conditions under which it can actually function well. And here is something worth sitting with honestly. None of this makes one way of living superior to another. Some people genuinely thrive in wide, active social ecosystems. They gain energy from it, think better in groups, and feel most like themselves when surrounded by others. That is a real, neurologically supported, and completely valid way to be human. What this is not is the only way. The person with the small circle is not a failed extrovert who simply gave up. They are a different configuration entirely, running a different but equally legitimate operating system. But here's the layer that tends to surprise people the most. The feeling of power that comes with a smaller social circle is not just psychological comfort or the relief of introversion. There is something structurally happening in the identity itself. When you are not managing a wide network of social expectations, you get your own opinions back. You stop unconsciously editing yourself to match the room you are in. Research in social psychology shows that the more expansive and diverse our social network, the more we tend to absorb the values, beliefs, and emotional states of the people around us. Psychologists call this social contagion, and it operates almost entirely below the level of conscious choice. We catch other people's anxiety without knowing it. We borrow their definitions of what success should look like. We begin measuring ourselves through their eyes without ever deciding to. The person with few close relationships is, often without realizing it, running far less of that background program. Their sense of identity is less crowded, less diluted, less pulled in competing directions by competing voices. Their decisions feel more like their own because in a very real sense, they are. That is not arrogance. That is not isolation. That is clarity. And clarity, sustained over time, feels powerful because it genuinely is. The quiet cost, though, is real and worth naming without flinching. A smaller circle means less redundancy in your emotional support system. When one of those few relationships strains or breaks, the impact lands harder. There is less buffer, less distribution of weight across a wider network. And in a culture that treats social fullness and busyness as visible signals of worthiness, choosing less can sometimes come at a quiet reputational cost. People misread you. They assume you are either above it all or beneath their notice. Neither of those misreadings is easy to live inside, but what tends to happen over time for people who are genuinely built this way is something subtle and deeply important. They stop requiring the misreading to be corrected. The internal reference point becomes more reliable than the external one. They stop auditing themselves through other people's perceptions as the primary source of data. And that, maybe more than anything else, is what power actually feels like from the inside. Not control over other people, not status or recognition, just a self that does not dissolve when no one is watching, and does not need to be validated to remain intact. If you recognize yourself in any of this and you want to work with this pattern rather than against it, there is one specific shift worth making. Not an overhaul, not a 30-day challenge, just one honest move. Start naming your relationships by what they actually give you in the present, not by how long they have lasted, how much history you share, or how guilty you would feel stepping back. Most people maintain connections out of habit, out of obligation, or out of a quiet fear of what it would say about them to let something fade. But the relationships that genuinely restore you tend to be immediately obvious when you get fully honest with yourself. Spend more of your finite relational energy there, not as a rejection of anyone else, just as a conscious, clear-eyed accounting of where your real depth actually lives. That one shift, as understated as it sounds, changes how people experience their own lives, because it makes the choice intentional rather than inherited. You were not misreading yourself all those years. You were not falling short of some standard you were supposed to reach. You were running a different operating system from the beginning. And the people who share it tend to figure out something quietly, over time, that takes the rest of the world decades to arrive at. Quality does not scale. Depth cannot be spread thin and still remain depth. If something in this reached somewhere specific for you, there is more territory worth exploring. What happens in the mind of someone who prefers silence over small talk, and why that preference is far more sophisticated than it looks. What psychology actually says about the people who process alone before they ever speak. Why the quietest person in the room so often turns out to be the one who understood everything. That is a story worth telling, and you are already most of the way there.